The rain in San Francisco didn't just fall. It bled into the concrete, turning the neon lights of the city into blurry, fractured streaks across the pavement. Inside the workshop on 7th Street, the air smelled of oxidized copper, cast iron, and the faint, sweet scent of cinnamon tea that 7-year-old Zoe had left cooling on a workbench. Danny Kowalski didn't look up when the thunder rolled. He didn't look up when his knuckles scraped against the rusted manifold of an old engine block, drawing a thin line of dark crimson that mixed instantly with the black grease on his skin. He was a man who lived in the silence between actions. A man who had long since stopped fighting the world and had simply chosen to rebuild it, piece by piece, in the shadows. Zoe burst through the plastic strip curtains separating their tiny living quarters from the main garage bay. Her mismatched socks, one bright yellow, one faded blue, scuffed against the oil-stained floorboards. In her small, paint-smudged hands, she held a crinkled sheet of construction paper. It wasn't a drawing of a house or a sun with a smiley face. It was a chaotic, beautiful blueprint of a mechanical hinge, drawn with a stubby red crayon. Across the top, in large, uneven block letters, she had written the word hope. Danny wiped his palms on a canvas rag that had seen better decades. He knelt down, bringing his gaze level with hers. He didn't offer a superficial compliment. He looked at the drawing the way a scholar looks at a text, acknowledging the weight behind her 7-year-old eyes. He knew why she drew hinges. He knew why she spent her evenings watching him sort through titanium scrap pieces and discarded pneumatic valves. She remembered the hospital rooms. She remembered the quiet, sterile hallway where they had left Liam, his younger brother, behind a curtain of white sheets because $250,000 was a number their reality simply couldn't manufacture. "The joint is too rigid, Dad," Zoe whispered, pointing her small finger at the crayon lines. "If it doesn't bend when she steps, it hurts. Right? Like Uncle Liam's chair?" Danny gently tucked a stray strand of her lopsided ponytail behind her ear. His hand was thick, heavily calloused, embedded with the permanent shadow of motor oil that no soap could ever fully erase. "We build them to give, Zoe," he said, his voice a low, steady rumble that anchored the restless room. "If it doesn't give, it breaks. Remember that." Before she could answer, the heavy steel roll-up door of the bay rattled violently. The sound of a dying alternator cut through the steady rhythm of the rain, followed by a harsh, metallic hiss as an imported luxury touring sedan shuddered to a halt just inside the dry threshold of the garage. The woman who stepped out of the driver's side looked like she had been carved from a single block of expensive Arctic ice. Lexi Donovan, chief executive officer of a multi-billion-dollar medical tech empire, did not belong in a place where grease stained the walls. Her cream-colored, tailored wool coat didn't have a single drop of water on it. Her blonde hair was pinned back with a precision that felt aggressive, and her eyes, sharp and restless, scanned the cluttered workshop with immediate, unadulterated disgust. She was on her phone before her heels even fully settled on the concrete floor. "I don't care about the logistics, Marcus." Lexi snapped into her Bluetooth earpiece, her voice slicing through the humid air of the garage. The vehicle died 3 blocks from the venue. Secure another transport now. "I have 80 shareholders waiting in the ballroom." She finally looked at Danny, her gaze sweeping over his oil-stained work shirt, his torn denim, and the scarred knuckles of his right hand. To her, he wasn't an engineer or a man. He was an inconvenience with a wrench. "You," Lexi said, pointing a manicured finger toward the smoking hood of her vehicle. "Fix it, immediately. I'll double your standard rate, triple it, whatever it takes to get this machine moving in 10 minutes. Danny didn't move. He stood there, grounded, his quiet masculinity a stark contrast to her frantic, high-gloss panic. "The alternator is seized, ma'am," he said calmly. 10 minutes won't clear the belt. It's going to take an hour just to cool down." "An hour?" Lexi's voice rose, a sharp, brittle sound. "Do you have any idea who I am? Do you have any idea what every minute of my time costs?" I don't pay for excuses from mechanics. From the passenger side of the luxury vehicle, the heavy door clicked open. A young girl, 15 years old, slowly swung her legs out. Sienna Donovan didn't look at her mother, nor did she look at the luxury surroundings she had grown up in. She reached down to lock the heavy, rigid titanium brackets of an incredibly expensive medical brace around her thighs, her face tightening into a grimace of pure, agonizing familiarity. The device was sleek, boasting the logo of a massive medical conglomerate, But as she attempted to slide into her wheelchair, her breath caught in her throat. Lexi didn't notice. She was already pacing, her fingers flying across her glowing screen, her internal pressure rising to a dangerous peak. But Danny noticed. He saw the subtle twist of Sienna's hip, the way the metal reinforcement forced her spine into an unnatural alignment, and the tiny, desperate bite she took out of her own lower lip to keep from crying out in front of her mother. Danny walked past Lexi, ignoring her sharp demand to get back to the engine. He approached the wheelchair, his large frame casting a long, protective shadow over the young girl. Without asking for permission from the billionaire executive, he slowly knelt down on the cold, greasy floor right in front of Sienna. "Get away from her," Lexi barked, turning around, her face pale with sudden, defensive fury. "Don't you dare touch her equipment. That brace is a proprietary clinical prototype. You'll ruin it." Danny didn't look up at the powerful CEO. His focus remained entirely on the teenager who was trembling slightly in the chair. He looked into Sienna's serious, tired eyes, and his voice dropped to a gentle, steady whisper. "Does it hurt?" he asked. The garage went completely silent, save for the rhythmic dripping of the rain outside. Sienna stared at the grease-stained mechanic, her breath hitching, a dangerous spark of something long buried flickering in her eyes. Sienna's fingers tightened on the armrests of her wheelchair, her knuckles turning a fragile, translucent white. She looked down at Danny's grease-stained hands, then back up into his calm, unblinking eyes. For 11 years, she had been surrounded by world-class physicians in sterile white coats who spoke about her body as if it were a complex, broken equation to be discussed in hushed tones at the back of a clinic. None of them had ever simply knelt on the floor and asked her how the metal felt against her skin. "Every time I take a step," Sienna whispered, her voice cracking under the weight of a confession she had kept hidden from her mother for months. "Every single time the mechanism locks, it feels like a dull iron spike is driving straight into my left hip." "Sienna, enough," Lexi interrupted, stepping forward, the sharp click of her designer heels echoing aggressively against the concrete. She placed a protective, defensive hand on her daughter's shoulder, her eyes flashing with a mixture of corporate arrogance and raw maternal panic. "Do not speak to him about your clinical symptoms. He is a local mechanic, not a board-certified orthotist. This device was custom-engineered by the absolute leading minds at Vanguard Biodynamics. It is a multi-million-dollar asset under a strict proprietary field trial. It is perfectly calibrated." Danny didn't rise from the floor. He remained in his crouched position, his steady demeanor completely unbothered by Lexi's sharp words. He pointed a thick, calloused index finger at a secondary load-bearing hinge near Sienna's lateral thigh support. "Your leading minds forgot that a human being isn't a static blueprint made of carbon fiber, ma'am," Danny said, his tone devoid of anger, carrying only the absolute heavy certainty of a man who knew exactly what he was looking at. "Look at the tension on this primary locking pin. The assembly is rigid. When she sits or tries to pivot, the frame doesn't bend with her natural anatomy. It forces her bone structure to adapt to the metal, rather than the metal supporting the bone. It's off by exactly 8 millimeters at the medial axis." Lexi went cold, her breath catching in her throat. She looked down at the brace, then back at Danny. "You're speaking nonsense to justify a standard repair fee. You operate out of a failing shop on 7th Street. You have no right to critique a medical advancement you couldn't possibly understand." From the shadows of the tool racks, Zoe stepped out quietly. She didn't seem intimidated by Lexi's expensive clothes or her freezing aura. She walked right up to Sienna's wheelchair, reaching into the pocket of her oversized denim jacket. She pulled out a small, slightly crushed strawberry hard candy wrapped in shiny red cellophane and gently placed it on Sienna's lap. "My dad knows exactly how the metal bends," Zoe said, her voice clear, innocent, and entirely unyielding. "He watches the shapes at night until the sun comes up. He says if a machine makes you cry, then the person who built it didn't use their heart." Sienna looked down at the tiny candy, a sudden, fragile smile breaking through the exhaustion on her young face. It was a rare, genuine moment of warmth that seemed to cut straight through the heavy, humid tension of the garage. Lexi watched her daughter's face soften, and for a split second, the cold corporate shield around the powerful CEO cracked. Lexi looked lost, emotionally helpless, against the simple reality that her billions hadn't bought her daughter a single hour of comfort. Danny reached into his back pocket and pulled out a small, worn calibration hex wrench. the one he used for fine-tuning precision fuel injectors. Let me release the pressure on the auxiliary strut, ma'am. Just 3 seconds. It won't alter the integrity of your prototype, but it will let her breathe. Absolutely not, Lexi snapped, though her voice lacked its previous razor-sharp conviction. She was panicking internally, trapped between her fierce protective instincts and the terrifying realization that this stranger might see something her high-paid engineers had missed. If you modify that casing, you violate our corporate liability insurance. Mom, please, Sienna pleaded, her voice thick with unshed tears. Just let him try. Please. Lexi froze, her hand trembling slightly against her expensive wool coat. She looked at Danny's face. There was no arrogance in his eyes, no desire to prove her wrong. There was only a deep, quiet masculinity that promised safety without demanding anything in return. She slowly stepped back, her silence acting as a reluctant, terrified permission. Danny leaned in closer, his movements becoming fluid, agonizingly precise. He didn't just turn the wrench. His fingertips hovered over the titanium alloy, feeling the microscopic vibrations of the metal as the internal tension began to ease. Lexi watched his hands. Her eyes narrowed in sudden, deep suspicion. These weren't the clumsy, heavy-handed movements of a neighborhood mechanic who changed oil filters and patched flat tires. The way he balanced the weight, the specific angle at which he applied counterpressure to the carbon housing, the absolute economy of his motion, it was the technique of a master craftsman, someone who had spent thousands of hours in a high-tech development laboratory. With a soft metallic click, the internal pressure valve within the brace released a tiny hiss of compressed air. Sienna suddenly gasped, her shoulders instantly dropping 3 inches as the rigid tension that had held her body captive for 11 years vanished. She looked down at her legs, her eyes wide with total shock. Lexi stepped forward, her heart pounding against her ribs. Sienna, what is it? What did he do? Before Sienna could answer, Lexi's gaze drifted past Danny's shoulder, landing directly on the back wall of the dark workshop. There, illuminated by a single, flickering fluorescent bulb, was Danny's secondary drafting table. Pinned to the corkboard was a complex, hand-drawn blueprint of an advanced biometric joint assembly, and scrawled across the margin in precise, geometric handwriting was a highly restricted structural physics equation that had been classified by the Federal Aviation Authority 5 years ago. Lexi's phone dropped an inch in her hand as a cold dread settled deep in her chest. She stared at the equation, then looked back at the quiet single father standing before her. "Who exactly are you?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Danny stood up slowly, the small hex wrench disappearing into the pocket of his greasy canvas pants. He didn't look at the drafting table, nor did he look at the classified equation that had frozen the billionaire CEO in her tracks. He simply reached out and adjusted the small wool blanket resting on Sienna's lap, ensuring the cold, damp air blowing in from 7th Street didn't aggravate her joints. "I'm a mechanic, ma'am," Danny said, his voice dropping into that low, flat register that refused to match her rising panic. Cars, trucks, hydraulic lifts. It's all just leverage and resistance. You spend enough time looking at broken things, you start seeing the patterns. "Don't lie to me," Lexi said, her voice trembling with a terrifying mixture of corporate authority and genuine shock. She walked closer to the corkboard, her eyes tracing the hand-drawn lines of the variable load fluid dynamic equation. "My company spent 3 years negotiating with the Department of Defense just to get access to the subroutines of that specific mathematical model for our heavy-duty prosthetic line. It's classified under the Federal Aviation Aerospace Protocols. A regular mechanic doesn't just see the pattern of a military flight stabilization algorithm." Before Danny could respond, the screech of high-end performance tires cut through the steady downpour outside. A massive, obsidian black luxury SUV slammed to a halt directly behind Lexi's stalled sedan, its headlights cutting through the dim workshop like twin searchlights. The doors threw open, and 3 men in tailored charcoal suits stepped out into the rain, led by a man with sharp features and a slicked-back undercut. Harrison Vance, the senior director of clinical compliance for Tech Brace Inc., marched into the garage, his umbrella held high by a silent assistant. He didn't look at the grease on the floor or the humble single father standing in the center of the room. His eyes went straight to Sienna's wheelchair and the unlatched diagnostic panel on her titanium brace. "Lexi, thank God we tracked the GPS," Vance said, his voice booming with arrogant efficiency. "The board is in absolute chaos at the hotel. We have 72 international investors waiting for the clinical demonstration." What is happening here? Why is the asset exposed? He looked down, finally noticing Danny standing next to the chair, the calibration tool still glinting in his pocket. Vance's face immediately flushed with an ugly, protective rage. Who authorized this person to touch a proprietary medical device? Vance yelled, stepping between Danny and Sienna. Get away from her immediately. Do you have any idea what the liability clause dictates? If this grease monkey has misaligned the pneumatic sensors, he's looking at a federal lawsuit that will strip this pathetic shack down to the foundation. Lexi didn't speak. She looked at Vance, then back at Danny, her mind spinning. The ruthless, highly controlled executive who ruled over 800 employees was completely paralyzed by the sudden, chaotic clash in the room. He didn't ruin it, Sienna said, her voice rising above the shouting men. She tried to shift her weight, her hands gripping the wheels of her chair. He made it stop hurting, Harrison. For the first time in 3 years, my hip doesn't feel like it's burning. Sienna, you are a patient. You don't understand the complex calibration matrices. Vance snapped, dismissing her with a cold flick of his wrist. Mechanic, step back right now before I call the local precinct to have you removed for tampering with medical property. Danny didn't blink. He didn't raise his hands, nor did his posture change. He stood like an iron pillar in the center of his own shop, his quiet masculinity radiating an absolute unyielding safety. You're loading the wrong axis, mister. Vance, Danny said softly, his voice cutting through Vance's corporate bluster with terrifying clarity. You built the brace to stabilize the hip by locking the lower tibia block, but you didn't compensate for the kinetic feedback from the ankle joint during lateral rotation. Every time she tries to turn, your software is fighting her natural biology. You aren't curing her. You're prisoning her. Vance froze, his mouth opening slightly, his corporate mask slipping for a fraction of a second. Who gave you our internal stress test data? Before the argument could escalate into violence, a small, warm hand slipped into Danny's large, grease-stained palm. Zoe had walked back out from the kitchen, her lopsided ponytail swaying. She didn't look at the angry corporate director or the black luxury vehicles blocking the door. She looked straight up at Sienna, holding a small, blue plastic cup filled with warm water. Here, Zoe said softly, her voice carrying an innocent absolute purity that made the entire room lose its breath. You look tired. When my dad works all night on his secret drawings, he always says a warm drink makes the heavy things feel a little lighter. Sienna reached out, her hands trembling as she took the cup from the 7-year-old girl. She looked at Zoe, then up at Danny, a single tear finally escaping her eye and tracing a path down her pale cheek. Lexi watched the exchange, her hand pressing flat against her stomach as she felt a strange, raw vulnerability tear through her chest. She had all the wealth in the world, the finest boardrooms, and the most powerful executives at her beck and call. Yet, in this dark, oil-scented garage, a penniless mechanic and his little girl were offering her daughter the one thing her billions had never been able to secure: peace. Vance aggressively grabbed the handles of Sienna's wheelchair, turning it toward the open bay door. We're leaving. Now. Lexi, get in the secondary vehicle. We will have our legal team issue a formal warning to this facility by midnight. As Vance began to push the chair into the driving rein, a sharp, metallic snapping sound echoed from the lower framework of the brace. Sienna screamed, her body convulsing with sudden, agonizing muscle spasms as the automated safety lock on the over-tightened machine seized completely. Vance panicked, letting go of the handles as the heavy chair began to tip toward the wet concrete edge. Danny moved before anyone else could breathe. Danny's boots skidded across the wet concrete floor as his massive frame lunged forward. Before the heavy steel wheelchair could tip over the edge of the garage threshold into the flooded alleyway, his arms locked around the frame like iron bands. Muscle straining against his grease-stained shirt, he threw his weight backward, wrenching the heavy chair and the terrified girl back into the dry center of the workshop. Sienna let out a high-pitched, ragged scream. The automated brackets on her legs were humming aggressively, a violent, high-pitched whine echoing from the carbon fiber housing. The electronic safety override had failed, and the mechanical hinges were closing tighter and tighter, clamping down on her thighs with crushing force. Lexi's corporate armor shattered into 1,000 pieces in a single heartbeat. She dropped her encrypted tablet, the expensive glass screen cracking against the floorboards. She rushed forward, falling to her knees beside the wheelchair, her hands trembling so violently she couldn't grip the manual release levers. Sienna! Oh my God! Sienna! Lexi cried out, her voice completely stripped of its chilling authority, replaced by the raw, suffocating panic of a helpless mother. "Turn it off! Harrison, turn it off right now!" What is it doing to her? Harrison Vance was sweating profusely, his fingers flying across a digital diagnostic remote control, his previous corporate bluster evaporating into frantic incompetence. The firmware is locked out. The system thinks she's in a high-impact fall state. It's purging the pneumatic reserve to immobilize the limb. I can't override the main server from here. "It's crushing her!" Lexi screamed, losing all control, tears streaming down her pale face, ruining her perfect makeup. She looked around the dark, oil-scented garage, completely vulnerable, stripped of the power her billions usually provided. She couldn't fix this. Her money couldn't rewrite the broken code of a malfunctioning machine. "Step back," Danny said. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried an absolute grounded weight that immediately silenced the panic in the room. He didn't wait for Vance to comply. Danny grabbed Vance's wrist, his grip unyielding, and physically moved the senior executive away from the control panel. Vance opened his mouth to insult him, to threaten him with a federal injunction, but one look at Danny's cold, focused eyes made the words wither in his throat. Danny knelt directly in front of Sienna. While the world was ending around her, he remained entirely steady. He placed his large, warm hands over her shaking fingers, drawing her focus away from the agonizing pressure in her legs. "Sienna, look at me," Danny said, his voice a low, soothing frequency. "Don't look at the metal. Don't look at the lights. Look right at me. I need you to take a deep breath and hold it. Can you do that for me?" Sienna nodded through her tears, her eyes locking onto his calm strength. "Zoe," Danny called out quietly, never breaking eye contact with the panicking teenager. "Bring me the silver tea handle from the third drawer of the heavy rolling cabinet, the one with the black tape." Zoe didn't freeze. She didn't cry. Growing up with Danny meant she had learned that when things break, you don't panic, you fix them. She sprinted to the back of the shop, her mismatched socks flying, and retrieved a specialized, precision-engineered titanium wrench that looked completely different from any standard automotive tool in the shop. Vance watched Zoe hand the tool to Danny, his eyes narrowing as he recognized the high-grade matte finish of the metal. "Wait a minute, that's an aerospace-grade manual bleeder. Where did a street-side mechanic get a proprietary military calibration key?" Danny ignored him entirely. He bypassed the digital interface completely, sliding the silver tool into a hidden, micro-machined emergency port beneath the primary battery casing, a port that wasn't listed in any commercial manual for the tech-brace systems. "The air in the piston is trapped," Danny explained to Lexi, his tone entirely professional, stripping away the complex engineering jargon so the terrified mother could understand the immediate reality. "The digital valve is frozen shut, so I'm going to vent the pressure manually from the bottom up. It's going to make a loud noise, but the pain will stop instantly." Lexi held her daughter's hand, nodding frantically, her knuckles white. She looked at Danny's weathered face, his quiet masculinity offering an emotional security she hadn't felt in 11 years. He wasn't doing this for a payout or a corporate promotion. He was doing it because a child was hurting. With a precise, calculated twist of his wrist, Danny applied exactly 40 inch-pounds of torque to the hidden valve. A sharp, deafening hiss of compressed pneumatic gas erupted from the base of the brace, spraying a fine mist of cooling vapor across the concrete floor. The rigid titanium brackets instantly popped open, backing away from Sienna's bruised legs by several inches. Sienna let out a long, shuddering gasp of pure relief, her body going completely limp against the back of the wheelchair. The agonizing pressure was gone. The storm inside her body had cleared. Lexi buried her face in her daughter's shoulder, weeping openly, entirely unconcerned with the charcoal-suited executives watching her from the open bay doors. She looked up at Danny, her eyes wide with a profound, terrifying realization. "You didn't just guess where that port was," Lexi whispered, her voice shaking as she stared at the specialized silver tool in Danny's hand, then at the classified flight stabilization equation pinned to the dark wall behind him. "You knew the exact internal architecture of the pneumatic housing. That system was adapted from the hydraulic landing gear of an advanced military stealth helicopter 5 years ago. Who are you, Danny?" Before Danny could answer, Vance stepped forward, trying desperately to reclaim his shattered authority. He adjusted his wrinkled suit jacket, his face twisting into an ugly, defensive sneer. It doesn't matter who he thinks he is. He just broke federal compliance laws by altering a registered clinical asset. Look at this place. He's a nobody living in Greece in poverty, trying to play God with stolen technology. I'm calling our legal division. We're impounding his tools, and we're shutting this illegal operation down by morning. Danny stood up slowly, towering over the executive. He didn't say a word, but his silence was more terrifying than any threat Vance could muster. The loud, metallic clang of the vintage rotary phone rattled against the high steel rafters, a blunt, analog sound that cut straight through the low hum of the dying storm. Harrison Vance scoffed, pulling a silk handkerchief to wipe a stray drop of rain from his cheek. "Probably a local collection agency tracking down your overdue utility bills," he sneered. "Let it ring. We are leaving." Danny didn't answer. He walked across the oil-stained floorboards, his heavy boots striking the ground with unhurried precision. There was no digital caller ID on the old wall unit. This line was a pure, unhackable copper wire. He picked up the heavy black receiver. "Kowalski." A voice boomed through the speaker, crisp, authoritarian, and laced with raw desperation. "Chief Warrant Officer Kowalski." Vanguard's civilian server just pushed a corrupted synchronization patch to their entire commercial line. The massive data surge has completely jammed the regional satellite's civilian bandwidth over the Bay Area. "It's a total digital gridlock." The general paused, a heavy, terrified breath coming through the static. "We have an advanced atmospheric medical transport, call sign Rescue 1, caught in the low-ceiling fog over the Golden Gate. Because their automated flight system runs on your original Kowalski matrix algorithm, the satellite gridlock has thrown the autopilot into a fatal telemetry loop. The main rotor stabilization joint is freezing up. The pilot is fighting a dead stick, and they are actively losing altitude. They have less than 10 minutes before they lose lift entirely and drop into the bay." At that exact moment, Harrison Vance's personal encrypted phone began to explode with automated sirens. He pulled the glowing device from his pocket, his face turning an ash-gray color as he stared at the scrolling red text. The server. The bandwidth overflow is cascading. It's rejecting the security layers. Lexi spun around, grabbing Vance by his expensive tailored lapels, her corporate armor completely shattered. "What do you mean, Harrison? What did your engineering team do?" We integrated the military drone stabilizer source code to cut development costs for the commercial market," Vance stammered, his corporate confidence evaporating as he stepped backward into a dark puddle of engine oil. "We didn't isolate the frequencies. The civilian requests are DDoSing the shared satellite transponder. It's locking out everything on that matrix." Lexi looked back at Sienna, who was safe only because Danny had manually vented her brace. The horrifying realization hit her. Her multi-billion-dollar empire, in its greedy pursuit of profit, had just blinded a flight of sick children in the sky. She turned to Danny, completely vulnerable. "Danny, please, tell me you can override the loop." Danny didn't look at the corporate executives. He looked down at Zoe. The 7-year-old girl walked over, gripping the frayed hem of his grease-stained shirt with absolute trust. "You can save them, Dad," Zoe said quietly. "You always find the broken pieces." Danny turned back to the phone. "General Sterling, cut the satellite routing. Patch me directly into the aircraft's internal radio frequency via an RF link. I'll handle the telemetry locally." Danny walked over to a heavy, padlock-sealed wooden crate beneath a thick canvas tarp. He pulled a silver key from his neck, threw open the lid, and revealed a ruggedized military-grade tactical radio terminal. As he flipped the heavy steel toggle switches, the screen flared to life in a stark, amber glow, tracking the rapidly descending altitude marker of Rescue 1. The countdown read, 8:14 to total aerodynamic stall. The amber glow of the military-grade terminal sliced through the dim shadows of the garage, painting Danny's weathered face in sharp, geometric lines. On the screen, a digital wireframe of the Rescue 1 medical helicopter spun erratically, surrounded by flashing red warning banners. The altitude numbers were cascading downward like a broken stopwatch. 2,400 feet, 2,200, 2,100. Harrison Vance backed away from the glowing terminal, his face completely drained of color. His expensive leather shoes squeaked against the wet floorboards. "This is impossible," he whispered, his corporate bravado entirely shattered. "That terminal, that's an Omega-class tactical node. The military decommissioned that entire development project 5 years ago when the chief designer vanished from the grid. Who gave you those encryption keys?" The heavy black speaker unit attached to the terminal crackled to life, and General Sterling's voice cut through the room with the force of a physical blow. "He didn't need anyone to give him the keys, Vance. He wrote the damn code. Lexi Donovan let go of her daughter's wheelchair, her hands dropping to her sides as if the gravity in the room had suddenly doubled. She stared at Danny's thick, calloused fingers as they began to fly across the mechanical keyboard. The sound was a rapid, rhythmic thunder, not the clumsy hunting of an auto mechanic, but the flawless, blinding speed of a master architect commanding a system he had birthed from nothing. "Danny Kowalski," Lexi said, her voice barely a breath against the roaring wind outside. "The Kowalski matrix, the variable load fluid dynamic equation pinned to your wall. You aren't a copyist. You're the original engineer, the one who designed the advanced automated flight controls for the experimental defense fleet." "Stand down, Lexi," General Sterling barked through the speaker. "Right now, your senior director's half-baked civilian patch has locked out the manual flight controls of a transport carrying 6 dying children. If Chief Warrant Officer Kowalski doesn't bypass your company's corrupt corporate firewall in the next 6 minutes, that aircraft is going to punch a hole straight through the surface of the San Francisco Bay." Vance stumbled backward, hitting the side of Lexi's stalled luxury sedan. He was trembling violently, his mind racing through the legal, financial, and existential ruins staring him in the face. We didn't know the safety protocols would cascade like this. We just wanted to optimize the market release schedule." "Shut up, Harrison," Lexi said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it possessed a terrifying, freezing intensity that made the executive freeze in his tracks. She didn't look at him. Her eyes were fixed entirely on Danny. She saw the absolute, unbroken calm in his posture. Amidst the flashing red alerts, the sirens blaring from Vance's corporate phone, and the literal life-and-death crisis unfolding in the sky, Danny remained an unshakable pillar of quiet masculinity. He didn't panic, he didn't shout, he just worked. Suddenly, the luxury sedan's integrated dashboard entertainment center flicked over to a mandatory emergency broadcast system triggered by the local authorities. A high-definition live video feed filled the glowing screens inside the car. A local news helicopter, hovering at the edge of the dangerous low-ceiling fog over the Golden Gate Bridge, was broadcasting the crisis in real time. Through the grainy, rain-swept footage, millions of viewers across the state were watching Rescue 1. The massive medical transport was tilting heavily to the left, its main rotor joint visibly seizing as bright white sparks erupted from the upper hydraulic housing. It was dropping through the gray clouds, spinning slowly, completely helpless against the laws of gravity. Outside the 7th Street workshop, the flashing red and blue lights of a local police cruiser reflected off the wet asphalt. The officer had stopped to clear the alleyway, but as the military encryption signatures bounced off the local grid, the neighborhood began to realize something extraordinary was happening inside the humble auto shop. Old Frank from the barber shop stepped out onto the rain-slicked sidewalk, wrapping his white apron tightly around his chest. Maria from next door stood at the edge of the open bay door, her house slippers soaked by the downpour, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and awe. A small, silent crowd of working-class neighbors began to gather at the threshold, watching in absolute silence as the quiet single father who had spent years fixing their rusty trucks and broken lawnmowers suddenly dictated terms to the United States military. "The primary firewall is looping, General," Danny said, his voice completely level, though a thin bead of sweat traced a path down his temple. "Vanguard's commercial encryption is using an outdated 12-bit token logic. It's treating my override commands as a hostile cyber intrusion. Every time I purge the pneumatic reserve, the civilian server rebuilds the lock." "Can you break it from the inside?" Sterling demanded. "They have 3 minutes of forward airspeed left before total aerodynamic stall." "I can break it," Danny said, his eyes narrowing as the amber light reflected in his pupils. "But I need a clean corporate master key to bypass the secondary validation loop. It's an encrypted alphanumeric sequence embedded in the executive administrative hardware." Lexi immediately reached into her coat, pulling out her encrypted global administrative tablet. "I have it! I have the master enterprise key!" "Don't give it to him!" Vance yelled, his voice cracking with pure, desperate panic as he lunged forward, his hands flailing. "Lexi, stop!" "If you activate the enterprise root code on an unauthorized military terminal, the federal network will automatically log our core system architecture. The Department of Justice will see that we illegally reverse-engineered classified defense subroutines. We will face federal corporate espionage charges. Both of us. The company will be ruined, and we are looking at federal prison." He wasn't fighting for the board or the patents anymore. He was a cornered rat, sweating profusely, terrified of the handcuffs waiting for him at sunrise. Lexi turned her head slowly, looking at Vance with a freezing, absolute disgust that made the executive freeze in his tracks. "There are 6 children in the sky who are about to die because of your criminal shortcuts, Harrison," Lexi said, her voice shaking with an ancient, deeply buried rage. "And you are standing in the dirt worrying about your prison sentence?" With a swift, brutal motion, Lexi ripped the biometric security badge from around Vance's neck and slammed it down onto the terminal next to Danny's scarred knuckles. Her hand was trembling, but as her fingers brushed his sleeve, she felt an incredible, solid wave of emotional security wash over her. "Thank you, Lexi," Danny said softly. He slammed his hand onto the execution key, routing the corporate clearance into the RF link. On the screen, a massive green progress bar began to tear through the red warning indicators. Through the speakers, the pilot's voice erupted in a terrified scream. "We've lost primary hydraulic pressure. The stick is dead. We're going into the water." Danny's thumb came down on the master override execution key with a single, deliberate strike. The mechanical clack of the keyboard resonated through the warehouse like a gunshot. For 3 agonizing seconds, the screen went completely black. Then, the terminal speaker exploded, with the violent, deafening roar of twin-turbine engines screaming under sudden maximum manual throttle. "The mechanical backup just kicked in," the pilot's voice shattered the static, cracking with pure relief. "The stick is alive! Pulling up! Pulling up!" On the luxury sedan's dashboard screen, the live news broadcast showed Rescue 1 defying gravity, its nose tearing upward, clearing the crest of a massive saltwater swell by less than 15 feet before stabilizing. "Flight path stabilized," General Sterling's voice came through, heavy with profound exhaustion. "Outstanding work, Chief Warrant Officer. The grid is clearing." A deafening cheer erupted from the neighbors standing in the rain outside. Inside, Harrison Vance completely collapsed, sliding down the wet side of Lexi's stalled luxury vehicle, his silk tie ruined, his face blank with the grim realization of his future. Lexi looked at him coldly. "You are fired, Harrison, and I will personally deliver the encrypted engineering logs to the federal prosecutors myself. Pack your life away. You're done." The local police officer stepped across the threshold of the garage, his heavy boots dripping rainwater onto the concrete. He didn't look at Lexi or Danny. His eyes went straight to Vance. "Mr. Vance, I just received a patch from Federal Transit Security. You need to step outside with me. There's a transport waiting for you at the corner." Vance's mouth opened and closed like a dying fish. He looked around the garage, seeking any ally, but found only the cold, disgusted glares of the working-class neighbors standing in the rain. He slunk out of the workshop, his head bowed, his expensive tailored suit soaked and ruined, completely humiliated in front of the very people he had dismissed as nobodies. The garage grew quiet again, the steady patter of the rain returning to its natural rhythm. Lexi slowly walked over to her daughter's wheelchair. She knelt down, her expensive white coat soaking up the oil and grease from the floor, without her even noticing or caring. "Sienna," she whispered, her voice raw. "I am so sorry. I built all of this, all the money, the companies. I thought I was protecting you, but I wasn't looking. I wasn't looking at you." Sienna reached down, her fingers brushing her mother's blonde hair. Then she looked up at Danny. "Can I try?" Sienna asked softly. "The weight feels completely different now." Danny nodded slowly, stepping forward. He didn't lift her, he simply stood close by, his quiet masculinity providing an invisible, unshakable safety net. He extended one calloused hand, offering her just enough leverage to find her balance. Sienna took a deep breath. She didn't bite her lip this time. She didn't brace for the agonizing iron spike in her hip. She shifted her weight, sliding her feet onto the concrete floor. Slowly, miraculously, she stood up from the wheelchair. She took one step, smooth. She took a second step, her alignment perfectly matching her natural stride. She took a third step, straight into her mother's arms. Lexi buried her face in her daughter's shoulder, holding her as if she would never let go, her hands trembling against Sienna's back. Over her daughter's shoulder, Lexi looked at Danny. The silence between them grew thick with a profound, unnameable emotion. She had spent her entire adult life believing that power was negotiated in boardrooms and measured in stock valuations. But looking at this tired father with the scarred hands and the little girl in the oversized jacket, she realized she had been entirely bankrupt. "How do I thank a man who just gave me my daughter's life back?" Lexi asked, her voice trembling as she looked into Danny's steady eyes. Danny reached down, gently adjusting Zoe's lopsided ponytail one more time before looking back up at the billionaire executive. "You don't thank me, ma'am," he said softly. "You just make sure nobody else has to hurt the way she did." Lexi stood there, the distance between her world and his suddenly feeling incredibly small, her heart shifting in a way she knew would alter the rest of her life forever. But the true resolution of the Kowalski Matrix was still waiting in the dark. 4 months later, the morning sun over Lake Tahoe didn't just rise. It shattered against the frozen surface of the water, scattering brilliant, blinding diamonds of light across the fresh November snow. The air was so crisp it felt sharp in the lungs, smelling faintly of damp pine needles and the deep, ancient stillness of the mountains. The world up here was incredibly quiet, a stark contrast to the clanging steel and roaring engines of 7th Street, yet the journey that had brought them to this alpine clearing had started in the dark corners of that very garage. Lexi Donovan parked the vehicle herself. There were no hired drivers today, no security details, and no frantic phone calls to corporate shareholders. She sat behind the steering wheel for a long moment, her hands resting loosely on the leather. She looked into the rearview mirror. In the back seat, Zoe was fast asleep, her lopsided ponytail pressed flat against the cold window glass, her small breaths leaving rhythmic plumes of mist on the pane. Next to her, Danny sat quietly, his large frame filling the space, his eyes fixed on the horizon where the dark green pines met the endless blue sky. "We're here," Lexi said softly, her voice carrying a deep warmth that had completely replaced the brittle, freezing tone she had carried for over a decade. Zoe stirred, blinking her eyes open as she looked out at the massive expanse of water. "It looks like a giant mirror, Dad," she whispered, her voice filled with the absolute unquestioned wonder of a 7-year-old. "Does the mirror have hot chocolate nearby?" Danny smiled, a real, unburdened smile that reached all the way to the deep lines around his eyes. "We'll find some, Zoe. I promise." The passenger door opened, and Sienna stepped out onto the crunching snow. She didn't reach for a wheelchair. She didn't wait for anyone to assist her. Beneath her thick winter coat, the specialized lightweight biometric brace that Danny had spent the last 4 months perfecting at the newly opened Kowalski Mobility Center was almost completely invisible. The heavy, torturous titanium brackets of Vanguard Biodynamics were gone, replaced by a fluid, silent system that worked with her body instead of fighting it. Sienna took a deep, steady breath, taking an internal inventory of her own muscles. Then, she started to move. At first, it was a tentative step, her boots sinking an inch into the white powder. But then, a sudden, fierce spark of pure freedom lit up her face. She began to run. She didn't limp. She didn't wince. Her brown hair flew wildly in the mountain wind as she sprinted across the wide, open clearing, her laughter echoing off the granite cliffs like music. It was a loose, uncalculated, joyful sound. The sound of a childhood that had been locked away in a metal prison for 11 years, finally set free. Danny stood near the edge of the tree line, his hands tucked into the pockets of his canvas jacket, watching her go. He didn't speak. He barely allowed himself to breathe, his quiet masculinity a steady, grounding presence in the center of the miracle. Lexi stood a few feet away, her expensive designer boots completely ruined by the deep snow, but she didn't care at all. She held her phone up, trying to capture the moment, but her hands were trembling so violently that the footage was completely unstable. Tears streamed down her face, biting cold against her cheeks, but she didn't wipe them away. She just watched her daughter run. She knew she would keep that shaky, blurry video for the rest of her life, because it was the only thing her billions could never buy. Sienna reached the far edge of the frozen clearing, nearly 50 yards away. She spun around, her face flushed brilliant red from the biting cold, her eyes shining with absolute light. She cupped her hands around her mouth and shouted across the expanse of snow, her voice carrying over the wind straight to the man who had changed her destiny. "Chief Kowalski," she yelled, using the title she had learned from the military journals. "Thank you for kneeling down on the floor that day. Thank you for looking at me." The mountain air held the echo for a brief, beautiful moment before letting it fade into the pines. Lexi turned toward Danny. She didn't say a word. She simply walked over to him, her steps heavy in the snow, and threw her arms around his broad shoulders. She held on to him with an absolute, desperate gratitude, weeping openly against his canvas jacket. The powerful, ruthless CEO who had once ruled through fear and isolation had finally found her peace in the protective strength of a humble single father. Danny slowly wrapped his arms around her, his thick, scarred hand resting gently against her back, offering her the silent, unyielding emotional security she had starved for since the day her daughter fell. Zoe stepped up beside them, sliding her small hand into Danny's pocket to find his thumb. She squeezed it tightly, looking up at him with her lopsided ponytail catching the bright mountain light. "I'm so proud of you, Dad," she whispered. Danny looked past them, his gaze drifting up toward the wide, brilliant November sky. His jaw tightened, and his eyes grew incredibly bright as he felt the heavy weight of the old gas receipt still tucked away in his leather wallet. "Liam," he whispered, his voice barely a breath against the wind. "We did it. We kept the promise." A few yards away, near the entrance of the public trail, a young boy of about 8 years old stood beside his mother. He was staring at Sienna. Around his left leg was a thick, old-fashioned, rigid medical brace, the metal clanking loudly as he shifted his weight. His face carried that specific, exhausting look of a child who had already given up on the idea of a normal life. Sienna noticed him. She stopped laughing, her expression turning serious and deeply empathetic. She walked over to the boy, ignoring the snow drifting into her boots. Slowly, deliberately, she knelt down in the deep powder, directly in front of him, bringing herself perfectly level with his eyes, just like Danny had done for her in a dark garage on 7th Street. She reached out, gently placing a hand on his metal bracket, and whispered 4 quiet words that only he could hear. "Pay it forward, okay?" The boy looked at her, his eyes widening as a sudden fragile warmth flickered in his chest. He nodded slowly, understanding the sacred weight of the request. This story teaches us that true power does not reside in the high-rise boardrooms of billionaires or the massive bank accounts of global conglomerates. Kindness is not a small, fragile thing. It is a force of nature. It moves quietly, traveling down an invisible chain of human hearts, changing lives in ways that no amount of status or credentials can ever replicate. Danny Kowalski didn't save those children in the sky, or the teenager in the wheelchair, because he wanted a payout or public admiration. He did it because he chose to stop, to kneel down in the dirt, and to pay attention to the suffering of a child when the rest of the world was too busy or too important to care. The miracle didn't begin with a complex equation or a multi-million-dollar laboratory. It began with a single father, a little girl's drawing of hope, and 3 simple words spoken on a greasy garage floor. "Does it hurt?"